Good evening. I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria, and tonight my guest is Mark Latchford of Pride in Diversity. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much, Greer. Delighted to be with you and the folks tonight.
One of the things that I really like, I think Pride in Diversity is not a well-known thing in the general public. So what is Pride in Diversity?
Pride Diversity was set up about 11, 12 years ago by 8 employer organisations in Australia to really progress LGBTQ workplace inclusion. Those 8 organisations, which included organisations such as the Defence Department, the Federal Police, Telstra, and also IBM, where I was at the time, recognised that there was really substantive work going on in North America and Europe, and it was about time to sort of double down on this demographic within the wider diversity and inclusion discussion underway in Australia.
And what is the overall structure of Pride in Diversity in how you first, as you said, came into being about 11 to 12 years ago? So what was the organisation that helped bring it into being?
We realised at the time, and I was on the board of the original advisory board of PID, that it was appropriate to embed it within the LGBT community and to also make sure that it was structured as a not-for-profit. So it was set up as an arm of ACON, which was formerly the AIDS Council of New South Wales. But unlike ACON, which primarily focuses on New South Wales, our remit is national. So we have member organisations we work with right around the country. We have team members who are located in multiple cities around the country. And as such, by being part of ACON, we're a not-for-profit. So our focus is explicitly on delivering support to employers and therefore supporting their employees.
In setting up the organisation, was there much sort of pushback from, sort of conservative style organisations?
Actually, the reverse. I mean, the organisations that were the sort of incubators or the initial supporters for Pride and Diversity, those original 8, I think they recognised that in Australia, organisations needed to do something in regard to LGBT inclusion because of the changes in the discrimination law, where discriminating based on sexual orientation or on gender identity was just illegal. So organisations really needed to get their act together to do something. But most organisations quickly realised that it was not just about legal compliance, but much more to do with winning the war for talent and making sure they could attract and retain the best people from right across the spectrum of Australian employees. And the fact that original membership, I suppose, has grown from 8 to about 350 organisations, that employer organisations we work with, just goes to show that there was an appetite to get support on this journey.
Having been involved with Seahorse for close on 20 years now, we've been primarily an organisation that sort of caters for that first social outing and people who are a little bit reluctant to be out in the open. And of course, one of the big things is what happens if people know about me, the antagonism that previous to a lot of the changes in anti-discrimination laws occurred, and the sort of secrecy that was involved. But it sounds like what's happening with your organisation is that you're really working to ensure that people can just be who they are.
The reality about what has happened over the last few years in this country is the conversation about LGBTQ equality has accelerated. The marriage equality plebiscite, if you like, or postal vote, the process most of us within the community hated, but the reality was it took the conversation about our demographic to more and more lounge rooms and households around the country. And that's sort of been parallel to what's been going on in the workforce. Organisations started to put their head around what not being out at work meant to members of our community. And some of the work we've done has been really focused on some of the data and the metrics to really prove to organisations that doing work in this space was really going to produce a productivity benefit, an innovative benefit, because people could bring their whole selves to work if an organisation provided the right environment for people to work in.
And that's right. I just know from my own experience talking to individuals and seeing how just sort of encouraging them not to be afraid to be open about yourself. Even within my own family, it sort of took a while to, this being afraid to sort of say, this is who I am. And in many ways, I'm a better person and therefore can function better in dealing with a hell of a lot of life.
People will come out at different speeds. Some people come out at work before they come out with their families, for example, especially those from a multicultural background. But the sort of the liberation that comes and when you come out in a safe environment translates into a renewed focus on your job, for example, and allows you to focus on what you're being paid to do rather than being worried about how your colleagues may react. And that's really a lot of what our conversation is about is what's the workplace behaviours that you really want to set for your organisation's values and missions. The good thing is, and again, we've got the data over the last decade to show it, is that people are feeling a lot more comfortable about coming out at work because the people around them are much more inclusive in their behaviours with them. The degree of inappropriate language, for example, has shrunk year after year. The degrees of more serious harassment and bullying to the LGBT community has also shrank over the years. It's not gone. So those who tell us that we've got what we wanted because of marriage equality, you should point to the fact that there's still work to be done in regard to making every workplace in this country, or every sporting code, or every environment that the LGBT community wants to participate in. But there's been great progress, but there's still more work to be done.
Are you finding organisations of their own volition are contacting you, or do you have to sort of go out and sort of knock on the door and say, look, we're here and this is what we can provide?
Organisations tend to look at who they're competing with or who they're collaborating with from an economic point of view, or from a public sector point of view, who they deliver services with. And we often find that people have been coming to us, and this has accelerated in the last few years. I was expecting during the pandemic to see a distraction, but if anything, we've seen the reverse, because I think people have recognised during the pandemic that organisations' well-being really comes back to the quality of the people they've got on board and their degree of engagement that they have, irrespective of whether you're a mining company, a manufacturing organisation, a university, or a local government. What makes the difference is the focus and the productivity and the well-being of their staff. And this is where I suppose where most of our work is focused on. And every week we hear people saying, I heard one of our competitors is working with you. Can you also work with us? Or we deliver work, for example, in the retailers. The major retailers encourage us to reach out to consumer product organisations as well as transport companies, just to take the conversation to as many workplaces across this country as possible.
Basically, Australia-wide, sort of, when you went into each of the states, was the reaction or acceptance of what you were trying to achieve uniform across every state, or did you find resistance?
Not a lot of difference between states. There's some really good work being done in the smaller states and in some of the unexpected industries. For example, you would sort of expect white-collar organisations, professional services firms, government departments and so forth to be working on this. But what's really been heartwarming to those of us at PID is to see the way that the discussion has been embraced by the construction industry, for example, or the mining industry. And the team at PID had the privilege of taking this conversation to nearly every BHP site in this country, for example. And we had to go to Olympic Dam, we had to go to their coal mines in Western Queensland. And that's really satisfying when you take the conversation to some of the places that probably don't have a lot of LGBTQ employees out and about at the workforce or even in the local community. And yet, once you start the conversation in those sites, common sense prevails and a new level of inclusion sort of cascades into that environment.
Are you finding that even though Pride and Diversity is sort of concentrating, in a sense, on the LGBTQ plus community, the impact on other sections of the community, particularly, say, Indigenous people or women in particular?
Very interesting comment, Greg. I'm glad you asked it. One of the things that I do is I co-chair something called the National Executive LGBTQ Allies Forum, which is a group of about 150 senior executives from across the country who meet quarterly. Most of them are not members of the community, but they're very keen to champion the demographic. And there was one senior federal bureaucrat on it, and I asked him at one of the forums, I said, why did you choose to support the LGBTQ community as opposed to, for example, the pursuit of gender equality within your particular agency? And he said to me, Mark, if I get my head around the invisible demographic and the levers I need to pull to support that demographic, I think those levers will be applicable to the other demographics I want to have within my agency. And I think that's true because many of the other demographics that people look at as part of a diversity strategy are visible, are obvious. Yet you'll never know who is a member of the LGBT community within your workforce. You know, if it's a welcoming place, more and more of them will be out and about in the workforce. But the reality is some will never come out in the workforce. But if you're pulling the right substantive levers, I would argue that it also applies, as my colleague I just mentioned did, it would also apply to the other demographics. And the reality is the LGBT community is not an isolated pillar. You know, we have many people who have got multiple identities. I mean, and there's nuances of experience within them. For example, we've noticed that those people from a multicultural background who are also happen to be LGBTQ, they tend to come out at the workforce first rather than their home community, which is often based around a strong faith, and therefore it's a less inclusive environment to come out. Another observation, again, through some of the research we do, was that the First Nations communities across Australia are very open-minded in regard to those who are gender diverse, perhaps more so than those who have diverse sexual orientation. So there's all sorts of nuances that reminds us that people have multiple identities. Another one which we noticed very early on, historically in Australia, women, LGBT women, were less likely to come out at work than men. And we looked into this to understand why. And it was related to some of the policies and some of the practices that organisations were doing, in particular that employee networks, which are the counsel to an organisation made up of LGBT employees and their allies, they were tended to be run by white males, LGBT males, except in Canberra, unusually. But anyway, over time, the networks have become a lot more diverse in themselves. Therefore, the lived experience they can talk about back to their companies and organisations is much more relevant for the wider LGBT community, I think.
That's right. I think, that, and that's one of the things I've advocated just within, when I talk to individuals who come along to Seahorse about is that, the acceptance of yourself is paramount to accepting other people, and that once you accept somebody else for who they are, it then seems to have a contagious effect in a sense that ultimately, as you've been describing, it has a much broader impact in the whole working environment.
And again, there was an example we had when we went up to the mine sites in Queensland. I went with a young lass from BHP who'd been in a same-sex relationship for a number of years in Brisbane, well known, and was out to all her colleagues at work. But when she relocated, she wasn't sure what the reception would be at the new location, which was a mine site camp. And the moment she arrived, all the lads on the site welcomed her enthusiastically. But this first question, or second question she was asked after her name was, did she have a boyfriend? And at that point, she had to decide, am I going to out myself to this folk I've only met literally 5 minutes ago, or do I self-edit? Do I start lying? And she chose the latter. And of course, about 6 weeks down the track, after 6 weeks of feeling very guilty, very reserved, not mixing with her colleagues and so forth, a work colleague came up from work, mentioned her female partner, much to the surprise of her colleagues because she'd been referring to a male partner. And her colleagues felt bad because they realised that she had assessed them as not being inclusive, yet they were quite open-minded. But they hadn't indicated that with their choice of language and their sort of the type of engagement they started with. But once the self-editing stopped, the woman in question was able to focus 100% on a job, building the relationship she was commissioned to do, and the conversation about the LGBT community accelerated exponentially in that particular location.
One of the things that I do find in when people sort of become comfortable with themselves, that ultimately you don't need to keep on reminding people that I'm different. In the end, you're just being able to sort of say, well, this is who I am. I don't need to keep referring to the fact that I'm trans or I'm gay or I'm a lesbian or intersex or whatever. And that sort of really makes working in the world, or even going to groups like I do with Toastmasters, as a fairly broad-based organisation of learning how to speak in public and having a diverse mix of members from every corner of the world, and no one bothers, because we're there for a particular reason, and the skills that we pass on to others or learn from others.
And it's interesting you say that, because it reminds me of, as we take our message, if you like, and our support out, I often spend a lot of time presenting to boards and senior leadership team, and you still get questions about, why are we talking about what goes on in people's bedrooms? And the good thing is, when those sort of questions come up, it's usually the colleagues around the table that sort of address the question rather than I. But the reality is, it's not about what goes on in people's bedroom. It goes back to what I call the business case. If you really want the best people, to be productive and innovative, and you also want to exercise a duty of care for your people, the sort of stuff we advocate is just inherently the right thing to do. And what's, again, as I said, it's really encouraged that more and more organisations, you don't hear these questions about why are we doing this. I think there's a comprehension across most organisations now about why this is important. But there is still a question of, well, how do we translate this into practical steps? Do we sponsor the Mardi Gras or Midsummer? Would that make a point that we're an inclusive workforce? And what's interesting, they're good things for organisations to do. But when you actually ask the Australian LGBT community, and we do it through our annual engagement survey we do, which last year got about 45,000 people do it. When you actually ask the community, what's the most important thing to me in the workplace for an inclusive environment, it's actually having visible, proactive allies, people who have your back, not in headquarters, but close to where I work. So when there's an example of bad behaviour or inappropriate language or whatever it may be, an ally has my back and will help step up to deal with this issue, whether it be from a colleague or even from a customer. One of the big challenges, the big retailers, they were keen to allow their staff to wear the rainbow badge, for example, as they worked. And yet they're a bit worried about how some of their customers would react. But because they built allied communities in every supermarket, they then went ahead with this program, and they got very, very little negative feedback and a whole lot of kudos.
With all the things that you've been talking about and the practical, or mentioned about being practical, so what's a typical sit down with a business, particularly say a mid-sized business, not a lot of employees, but how would your staff in, say, Melbourne, for instance, go into a business, and what are the things that they talk to the HR and the managers about?
It's not a complicated recipe, and I suppose our council or our roadmap is built up through a decade of looking at what works and what doesn't work. But you've already touched upon things that are pretty essential, the building blocks. One is to have HR viewing this as an important part of their day job, identifying at least someone from within the organisation, one or more, who could act as an employee network, or as I often describe it, as the counsel to the business. Because an HR department may make a call on what's important, yet it's best to get the voice of the stakeholders. So if you've got even one person out in the workforce, get them in the room to join the conversation. If you've got the building blocks of HR plus LGBT employees working together, you'll inevitably progress. And there's about 8 areas we encourage organisations to look at, even if they're small organisations to some of the largest employers in the country. Look at your policies. Are they inclusive overtly of the LGBT population? Have you looked at things like affirmation leave for people who are affirming their gender while employed at your organisation? Have you looked at things like dress codes where applicable? And have you looked at the situation in regard to all gender bathrooms? So these are policy areas is one area. But we also talk about executive communication. You are going to get some people who are sceptical, or this is not the right priority. So are your leadership prepared to support this initiative and communicate it? And other areas include, how are you going to communicate that this is an important demographic within your workforce? Are you going to mark Ida Hobbit Day along the same lines as you may mark Reconciliation Week or World Women's Day and so forth? So there's some things that people, irrespective of size of organisation, they could start their journey on.
So it's obviously a very comprehensive way in which you approach it, and as you say, with lots of data and historical evidence as to how it does impact on it. So how do you sort of see going from now into the longer term future? What are your sort of hopes and expectations?
I often joke to my team that it'd be great if we were redundant in 5 years. But I think because the conversation will be so permeated across this country that there'll be no need to do policy changes or practice changes or whatever it is. But the reality is, if you look at how far we've come with gender equality in the workforce and how far to go, this may be a never-ending journey. But what I've seen over the last decade would suggest that we've got every room for optimism. But there are things we need to do more work on. And there's still a difference between the experience of people working in the city versus regional Australia. So that's one of the areas we want to focus on. So we avoid this sort of perceived brain drain of LGBT employees from the city to the bush, because from the bush to the city, I should say, because the reality is we need people working in all parts of Australia. And they need to work in an inclusive environment. So that's one area of focus. What's really interesting over the last few years, one of the things we do alongside many other organisations is we provide affirmation support to those who are affirming their gender while employed, but also supporting their management and their colleagues. And we've probably done 200 or 300 of these over the last few years, which is exponentially growing. And that would suggest to me that more and more people are feeling confident of affirming their identity while employed. And if we can support them and their management can support them, evidence shows that they're very loyal and very committed to that particular organisation. But there's still quite a lot of work to do for organisations to get their head around diverse gender in the workforce, all the way back to recruiting. And there's an example I'll point to where a few years ago, I asked one of the biggest consulting firms, did they, in their application forms online, did they still allow an opportunity for someone to indicate if they had a maiden name? And they said yes, because we still have female employees who have changed their name when they got married. And I actually suggested to them, why don't you follow the example of the Immigration Department with their visa forms? Because anyone who's applied for a visa to this country will know that there's an opportunity to declare if you've been known by another name.
That's right, because, particularly in the trans community, and I know, we all come up with a name that we identify ourselves for, and I suppose one of the privileges of trying to work out your identity is to try out different names, and you're quite often known by that, but for legal reasons, you've still got your original identity name and gender markers around, and that really makes a big difference. Because recently I had a bit of a health scare where the triage nurse made on their documentation my preferred name, even though I've got a legal name in a different format.
The argument being, if you actually had a more inclusive form that allows people who have changed their first name rather than their family name, which is more common in the trans and gender diverse community, it sends a cue to a trans applicant that this organisation would be open to the fact that I may be applying with a university degree or a security clearance in a different name. And so we're doing some work actually with Curtin University, sort of looking into this in more detail, just to sort of educate the wider employer community about some little things they could do that could make the world a difference on this journey. But you asked the question about other things going forward. We actually, at the behest of the community, developed two complementary programs in more recent years. One's focusing on inclusion in sport for the LGBT community, and one is particularly focused on service provision. We call it Pride in Health and Wellbeing, because these are two areas where there's still got more work to go. Sport is an inherent part of the Australian community, psychosis, if you like, psychology, and yet there's a lot more work to be done. Great work by most of the sporting codes in working out pathways, for example, for gender diverse people to participate in sport. But there's still more work to be done. And likewise in service provision. And what we talk about that, if you're a member of the LGBT community and you want to engage, whether it be shopping, but in particular with the medical practitioners and service providers, it's really important that the doctors and nurses and aged care and everyone else you may want to engage with, that they understand some of the unique challenges of the LGBT community. So those two programs focus on future work areas that we think are important.
One of the things that the, say, AFLW demonstrated is how many of the players who quite willingly and publicly and openly demonstrate their gender identity or their sexuality without any quibbles whatsoever. And I think that's been one of the very public measures that an organisation can engender, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And so these are some areas that that will keep us sort of busy and active. And there's always nuances. That there is occasionally people will say, "Well, you're trying to restrict or exclude people of faith in a workforce," and it's not about people's beliefs at all. It's all about behaviours, workplace behaviours that align with the values of the organisation, which has a big respect of the individual, of all the individuals within that organisation.
A little bit on the personal side for you, Mark, is what attracted you to apply to join this organisation?
It's an interesting story because at the time I first met Pride University, I wasn't in the community, but I was a senior executive at IBM and had spent over 3 decades exercising a traditional corporate career. I was posted to Europe, twice to Asia. I was running multi-million-dollar businesses. And at the time, each of the general managers in Australia were asked to sponsor one of the demographics. So that's where I first got involved with this demographic. But after I retired, and having frankly worked for myself, for the money, for career advance, etc., I had the opportunity to join PID to work for a purpose. And I said I'd join for a year or so and scale the organisation, what we do, and who we did it with. And I'm 4 years on. I love it. It's I can see it making a difference. The feedback we get from LGBT employees is saying we've assisted in them coming out to bring their whole self to work. So it's great to work for a purpose rather than just for the bank account.
Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure to fortunately have you do something that you consider to be worthwhile and for a purpose. And to tell us about what Pride in Diversity is about, it's obviously an organisation that is having a major impact in the way Australians view themselves, both in work and at a personal level. And thank you very much for joining us in the conversation tonight.
Thank you, Greer. And if anyone would like to continue this conversation or discuss what we do, prideinclusionprograms.com.au is the right way to find us. And we'd love to have a conversation with anyone about how we can help. So thank you very much, Greer. Really appreciate the chance to join you tonight.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Greer McGeary. Thank you for watching Ben TV.